the most expensive word in the English language, is the one a billionaire uses incorrectly in a binding contract. Power, in its most intoxicating form, does not announce itself with violence. It arrives in the architecture of ordinary moments. In the way a man snaps his fingers for service, in the angle of his chin when he dismisses a question, in the particular contempt with which he looks at someone who pours his water and assumes, with the absolute confidence of someone who has never been wrong about anything he could afford to be right about, that the person holding the pitcher has nothing inside her head worth the trouble of discovering. The truly dangerous rich are not the ones who shout. They are the ones who whisper and expect the world to lean in. Dorian Ashworth, 63 years old, chairman of the Ashworth Group, a vertically integrated conglomerate with 14 subsidiaries across 4 continents, and a personal net worth that had recently eclipsed the GDP of a small Baltic nation, is this kind of man. He has never shouted in his professional life. He has never needed to. He simply speaks, and rooms reorganize themselves around his sentences like iron filings around a magnet. But tonight, in the private dining room of the Hotel Cassini in Milan, on the eve of the most consequential merger in his company's 40-year history, Dorian Ashworth makes a mistake. He calls a waitress uneducated. Her name is Sarah Mancini. She is 32 years old, the granddaughter of a Sicilian linguist, and the daughter of a Neapolitan notary, raised in Naples until 14, then Bologna until 22, then Paris for 3 years, then London for 2, and now Milan for the past 5. Not because she drifted, but because each city was a library. She decided to read completely before moving to the next one. She holds a first-class degree in comparative literature and linguistics from the University of Bologna, a postgraduate certificate in legal translations from the Sorbonne, and a professional certification in contract interpretation from the London Institute of Linguists, which she obtained on evenings and weekends during the 2 years she spent managing the front of house at a Michelin-starred restaurant in Clerkenwell. She has been waiting tables at the Hotel Cassini for 11 months. She took the job because the hours allow her to translate legal documents freelance during the day, and because the Cassini's private dining rooms host, with reassuring regularity, exactly the kind of conversations that a woman who translates contracts for a living finds professionally illuminating. She is carrying a pitcher of still water. When Dorian Ashworth says it, he says it to his lawyer, a compact, preening man named Geoffrey Sloane, who has the alert, slightly hunted expression of someone paid to anticipate disaster, and increasingly aware that his client may be generating more of it than he can contain. They are seated at a table for 8, but only 4 seats are occupied tonight. Dorian and Geoffrey on one side, and across from them, 2 men who have flown in from Frankfurt, Werner Brandt, chief legal officer of Hesselag, and his associate, a younger man named Tobias Rice, who has said almost nothing all evening, and whose eyes, Sarah has noticed, move across every surface in the room with the careful, unhurried attention of someone who is recording everything. The dinner is in its 3rd hour. The main course plates have been cleared. She is refilling glasses before dessert. Dorian is speaking in the particular voice he uses for pronouncements, not loud, but resonant, with the weight of a man accustomed to being the most certain person in any room. He is speaking about the merger agreement, a 47-page document that would see the Ashworth Group acquire an 80% stake in Hesselag's European Logistics Division. He is speaking specifically about a clause, Article 9, Subclause 4 BAP, which he has described 3 times this evening as ironclad, and which his lawyer Geoffrey has confirmed 3 times with the eager nod of a man who has learned to agree with expensive clients and worry privately. Sarah reaches across to refill Werner Brandt's glass. She is close enough to read the page that Dorian has open on the table beside his dinner plate. Close enough, in fact, to see the specific phrase in Article 9, Subclause 4 BAB, that has been underlined in ink and circled with a small annotation in the margin. She reads it in the 2 seconds available to her. She straightens. She moves to refill Dorian's glass. He waves her away without looking at her. Not rudely, not with intent. With the absent-mindedness of a man for whom other people's presence is a form of ambient noise, like traffic or birdsong, acknowledged only when it becomes inconvenient. The indemnification cap, he is saying to Werner Brandt, is structured to include consequential damages arising from operational disruption, exceeding the threshold as defined hereunder. Which means any claim your board might consider bringing post-close is categorically excluded. The language is airtight. Werner Brandt smiles the particular smile of a German lawyer who knows something the man across the table does not. We have, of course, had our own counsel review the language, he says. We are satisfied. There is something in the way Werner says satisfied. A fractional pause before the word, a quality of containment in the syllables, as if the word is a lid placed carefully over something larger, that Sarah notices as she moves to the service station at the far side of the room. She has been in rooms like this for 11 months. She has poured water during 7 acquisition discussions, 4 restructuring negotiations, 2 hostile takeover conversations that ended in raised voices, and 1 that ended in a broken wine glass, and a private equity partnership dissolution that required the intervention of 3 separate translators. She knows what it sounds like. When a man believes he has won something that he has not yet understood, he has already lost. She is setting the picture down when Dorian says it. He is telling Jeffrey, who is checking something on a tablet, distracted, about his drive from the airport. A small story, a throwaway anecdote, in the way powerful men occasionally let their guard down in private rooms, by telling small stories to subordinates between the significant moments. He says he stopped at a cafe near the Duomo, and that the woman at the counter spoke no English, and that he had to use a translation app because, and here he pauses, chuckling slightly, these people, the service class, the waitresses and the counter girls, they simply don't have the education for it. He does not say it in her direction. He does not know she is in the room. That is the nature of the specific contempt. It requires no audience because it expects no opposition. It is not a performance. It is a belief. Sarah does not react. She does not move. She stands at the service station and she breathes. One slow, full breath, the kind her grandmother used to prescribe for moments, when the impulse to respond arrives before the wisdom of knowing how. Her grandmother, Professor Concetta Mancini, who taught linguistics and semiotics at the University of Palermo for 31 years, who had 7 published books and 2 honorary doctorates, and who spent her last years in a small apartment in Mondello, translating obscure medieval Arabic legal texts into Italian for a university press that paid almost nothing and brought her complete satisfaction. Her grandmother used to say, La parola sbagliata in un contratto vale milioni. La parola giusta di più. The wrong word in a contract is worth millions, the right one more. Sarah looks at the document on the table. She looks at the underlined phrase in Article 9, Subclause 4. She thinks about what she read in the 2 seconds she had. She thinks about the 17 months she spent at the London Institute of Linguists, studying contract language under Professor Alistair Drummond, who had spent 40 years as senior clerk at the English Court of Appeal, and who had a particular gift for showing students the way that a single imprecise word in a legal document could, under the right interpretive pressure, mean the precise opposite of what its author intended. She picks up the dessert menu cards. She walks back to the table. She distributes them, moving quietly around the perimeter. She reaches Dorian Ashworth's place and sets the menu card down, and, as she does, she says, quietly, in the tone of someone noting something incidental, something that requires no particular response, "Excuse me, Mr. Ashworth. I believe there may be an issue with the language in Article 9. The table goes very still. Not loudly still, not the theatrical silence of a confrontation. Just the small, specific stillness of a room in which something unexpected has been introduced into a conversation that was not designed to include it. Dorian turns and looks at her for the first time. He sees a woman in the white shirt and dark apron of the Hotel Cassini service staff, holding a dessert menu, standing with the particular composure of someone who does not appear to find the silence uncomfortable. He looks at her the way he looks at objects that have moved without being touched. "I beg your pardon," he says, not as a question, as a correction. Article 9, Subclause 4, she says, the phrase as defined hereunder. It refers forward in the document to the definition section. The definition section is Article 14, but Article 14 defines operational disruption threshold with reference to the German regulatory framework under Section 313 of the BGB, the Bürgerliches Gesetzbuch. Rather than English contract law, the indemnification cap is governed by which legal system's definition of threshold applies. If German law governs that definition, the threshold is significantly lower than the threshold under English law. The consequential damages exclusion may not hold. No one at the table speaks. Jeffrey Sloane has stopped looking at his tablet. Werner Brandt's smile has not changed, but something behind it has shifted. Deepened, perhaps, like a color becoming more saturated. Tobias Rice, the young associate, who has said almost nothing all evening, has straightened very slightly in his chair. Dorian Ashworth stares at her. There is a process happening behind his eyes. A recalibration, a rapid reassessment. The particular cognitive event of a man discovering that the room he believed he fully understood contains a door he did not know existed. "You are," he says slowly. "A waitress," she says. "And I have a postgraduate certificate in legal translation from the Sorbonne and a professional certification in contract interpretation from the London Institute of Linguists. I've translated 41 merger and acquisition agreements in the past 3 years. I noticed the language in Article 9 when I refilled Mr. Brandt's glass." She pauses. "I thought you should know." Jeffrey Sloane picks up the document. He turns to Article 9. His eyes move down the page. They find the phrase. They track forward to Article 14. His face, which has maintained the trained composure of a senior commercial lawyer for most of the evening, does something involuntary. A small, specific contraction around the eyes, the expression of a man arriving at a conclusion he very much does not want to be arriving at. "Christ," he says, very quietly, to no one in particular. Dorian does not look at Jeffrey. He is still looking at Sarah. The look has changed. The first look was the look he gave her when she was invisible, the absent-minded wave. The second look was the look he gave her when she surprised him, the object that moved without being touched. This is a third look. It is harder to name. It is the look of a man who has lived for 63 years inside a particular understanding of who is worth paying attention to, and has just been handed evidence that the understanding requires revision. "Explain it," he says. "The full implication." She pulls out the chair beside Jeffrey Sloane, the one empty seat on that side of the table, and sits down, not with presumption, not with triumph, with the straightforward practicality of a woman who has been asked a professional question and intends to answer it properly. She turns the document to face her. The indemnification cap in Article 9(4)(b) is designed to exclude consequential damages, she says. The cap applies when the claimed damages arise from, quote, operational disruption, exceeding the threshold as defined hereunder. The word hereunder in English contract law typically refers to the document itself, and specifically, in constructions like this one, to provisions that follow. It points to Article 14. She turns to Article 14. Article 14, paragraph 3, defines operational disruption threshold as, and I'm reading directly, disruption exceeding the level prescribed under applicable regulatory standards for commercial logistics operations in the relevant jurisdiction. Applicable regulatory standards and relevant jurisdiction are not further defined in the document. She looks up. 4 pairs of eyes are on her. Jeffrey's contains a specific species of dread. Werner Brandt's contains a specific species of patience. The patience of someone who already knows where the river goes and has been waiting for others to follow the current. In the absence of a governing law clause specifying which jurisdictions regulatory standards apply, she continues, a court interpreting this agreement would look to the jurisdiction of the contracting party, whose standards are most relevant to the operation in question. Hessel AG's logistics division operates primarily under German regulatory frameworks. Under Section 313 of the BGB, the doctrine of Störung der Geschäftsgrundlage, the disruption of the basis of transaction, threshold, is interpreted considerably more broadly than under English common law. A German court applying that standard to Article 14's definition would find that the indemnification cap is triggered at a lower threshold of disruption, which means Ashworth Group's exposure to consequential damages claims is significantly larger than Article 9 was apparently intended to create. She closes the document. She places her hands flat on the table, the same way her grandmother used to place her hands on a manuscript when she reached the end of an argument she considered complete. The merger agreement, as written, not exclude consequential damages above approximately 40 million euros under German regulatory interpretation. Under the English law interpretation your counsel appears to have been applying, the cap would exclude damages up to approximately 340 million euros. She pauses. The difference is 300 million euros, and the question of which interpretation applies has not been resolved by the document. The silence this time is different. Fuller, the kind of silence that follows, not a surprise but a conclusion. The silence of four people sitting inside the same understanding, and none of them wanting to be the first to speak it. It is Werner Brandt who speaks first. He speaks in German, and he speaks to Tobias Reiss, and what he says, which Sarah understands, because German is the fourth of her 6 languages, after Italian, French, and English, before Spanish and Portuguese, is, sie hat es gefunden. She found it. Tobias Reiss nods once, the nod of a man confirming something he already knew. Dorian Ashworth does not speak German. He does not know what has just been said across his table, in a language he never found it necessary to learn, by men he flew to Milan to negotiate with in his own private dining room. He looks at Sarah. What did he say? She looks at him. She holds his gaze for a moment. Not with hostility, not with satisfaction, but with something quieter and more complete than either. Then she translates. He said, she found it. The room absorbs this. Geoffrey Sloane sets the document down on the table with the careful deliberateness of a man placing something fragile. He picks up his phone. He dials. He speaks quietly and urgently to whoever answers. She does not listen, because it is not her conversation. And then he is on his feet, moving to the corner of the room, his voice low and rapid. Dorian Ashworth is still at the table. He is looking at the closed document. He is doing what she has watched powerful men do in their worst moments, searching themselves for the error, retracing the steps that brought them here, and finding, somewhere in that retracing, the specific moment when they chose not to look at something that was asking to be looked at. He looks at her. You've been waiting tables here for how long? 11 months, and before that, London. Paris, Bologna. She pauses. I go where the work is. He is quiet for a moment. Then, the document. Is it fixable before signing tomorrow, she considers. The simplest fix is a governing law clause added to Article 14, specifying that applicable regulatory standards means English law standards for the purpose of this agreement, regardless of the jurisdiction into which the relevant operations are conducted. It is 3 lines. Any competent drafter can add it tonight. She pauses. You'll need Hessel's counsel to agree to the amendment. That's a different conversation. He looks across the table at Werner Brandt. Werner Brandt, who has been watching all of this with the expression of a man watching a play he has already read. Not because he staged it, but because he is fluent in the language it was written in. Meets Dorian's look without flinching. Werner, Dorian says. Did you know? Werner is quiet for a moment. Then, with a precision that is itself a kind of answer. Our council identified the ambiguity in the language 6 weeks ago. We raised it with Jeffrey in a written note. We were told the language was intentional. He pauses. We were satisfied to proceed on that understanding. Jeffrey Sloan, in the corner of the room, goes very still. Dorian does not look at Jeffrey. He keeps his eyes on Werner. Something is happening in his expression, a long, slow process, like ice contracting in cold. A structural change that is barely visible but alters everything. He has been in business for 40 years. He has closed more transactions than most people will be proximate to in a lifetime. He has built a company from a single industrial cleaning supply firm in Leeds into a 14-subsidiary global conglomerate. He is not a foolish man. He is, in fact, an exceptionally intelligent one. He has simply. And this is the specific failure of a particular kind of intelligence, confused being the smartest person in the rooms he constructed with being the smartest person in every room. He looks at Sarah. I owe you an apology, he says. The words arrive without ceremony, not lavish, not performed. Just flat and accurate, the way he delivers all his sentences. What I said earlier about the service class, the education. She looks at him. She has been waiting for this, or something like it, with the particular patience of someone who knew it was coming, but was not certain which form it would take. She does not want an apology. She does not need one. But she listens to it, because it is being offered correctly, and because her grandmother also used to say, "It is not the injury that defines a person. It is what they do when they understand it." "Thank you," she says. He nods. He picks up the document. He opens it to Article 14. He reads it again, the way he should have read it the first time. Not with the confidence of a man confirming what he already believes, but with the attention of a man who has learned, in the past 20 minutes, that the difference between those two kinds of reading is 300 million euros. He looks up. "What is your name?" "Sarah Mancini." "Do you take freelance work?" She considers him for a moment. "That depends on the work." The Ashworth Group closes transactions in 7 countries. We use 4 translation and interpretation firms. None of them caught this. He pauses. "I am suggesting that we may be using the wrong firms." Jeffrey Sloan has returned to the table. His face carries the expression of a man who has spent the past 6 minutes receiving information he will need several more hours to fully process. He sits. He looks at Sarah. He looks at the document. He looks at his client, Jeffrey. Dorian says, "Kindly draft the governing law amendment to Article 14 for Hessel's council to review tonight. Use plain English, no complexity." He pauses. "And I'd like a word with you separately after dinner about the written note from Werner's team 6 weeks ago." Jeffrey nods. The nod of a man navigating between one catastrophe and another, grateful only for the direction of travel. Dorian looks at Sarah. He reaches into his jacket pocket and produces a card. Not a standard business card, but a personal one. Heavy paper, the specific weight of material printed in small quantities for people whose contact details are not widely distributed. He places it on the table in front of her. "When you have a moment," he says, "I would appreciate a conversation." She looks at the card. She does not pick it up immediately. She looks at Werner Brandt, whose expression has modulated into something warmer, a frank and collegial warmth, the warmth of recognition between people who speak the same professional language and have just been in the same room when it proved useful. She looks at Tobias Rice, who has, for the first time all evening, allowed himself a small smile, the uncontrolled kind, the kind that arrives before you can compose it. She looks at the document. Article 9, Subclause 4, the indemnification cap, 300 million euros balanced on the definition of a single word. And the word found in 2 seconds by a woman whose water pitcher was being waved away. She thinks of her grandmother's apartment in Mondello. The small desk by the window, the medieval Arabic texts spread across it in long curling sheets, the smell of coffee and old paper, and the particular quality of Sicilian afternoon light that made everything look illuminated from within. She thinks of her grandmother's voice, reading aloud a passage she had been working on for days. her eyes moving across the Arabic, and her lips forming the Italian, as if the translation was not something she was producing, but something she was uncovering. Finding the thing that was always there, beneath the surface of the words. La parola sbagliata in un contratto vale milioni. La parola giusta, di più. The wrong word in a contract is worth millions. The right one, more. She picks up the card. She puts it in her apron pocket, next to the order pad she has not needed to use all evening. She stands. "I'll bring the dessert," she says. She crosses the dining room to the service door. She pushes through it. On the other side, in the white light of the kitchen corridor, the head waiter, a Florentine man of 60 named Renato, who has worked at the Cassini for 22 years, and who has seen, from the perimeter of private dining rooms, more of the internal machinery of global commerce than most journalists will accumulate in a career, looks at her with the particular look of a man who has been watching through the small glass window in the service door, and knows, from the specific choreography of what just happened, that something significant occurred. "Tutto bene?" he asks. "Everything all right?" She picks up the dessert tray. She looks at him. She thinks about this question. Whether everything is all right. And what all right means in the context of a room where a man said something contemptible and then had the intelligence to reckon with it, and where a word in a contract meant the wrong thing, until someone stopped long enough to read it correctly, and where the difference between the two is a number with 8 digits, and the lesson that the most dangerous assumption a powerful person can make is that the people around them have nothing to teach. "Si," she says. "Yes." She picks up the tray. "Tutto bene." She goes back through the door. In the dining room, Jeffrey Sloan is drafting on his laptop, his expression focused and slightly haunted. Werner Brandt and Tobias Reiss are speaking quietly in German. A different conversation now, easier, the conversation of people who have watched a situation resolve. Dorian Ashworth sits with the merger document open in front of him, his reading glasses on his nose, going through it page by page with the deliberate attention of a man who has decided to understand something he previously only assumed. She sets the dessert, a panna cotta with a reduction of blood orange, the Cassini's signature, in front of each of them. She refills the water glasses. She does all of this with the quiet efficiency she has developed over 11 months, and 3 countries and 6 languages, and a career built on the conviction that the most important things happen in the margins, in the footnotes, the subclauses, the fine print, the moments between the official moments when people assume they are not being heard. Dorian looks up when she sets his glass down. He looks at her with the third look, the one that came after the wave and the stare, the one that is harder to name. He starts to say something. He stops. He starts again. "Mrs. Mancini," he says, "for what it's worth, you were the most useful person in this room tonight." She looks at him. She thinks about what her grandmother would say to this, about usefulness, about visibility, about the specific algebra of being seen only when you have already proved your value, and whether that algebra is ever truly solved or only temporarily balanced. "I know," she says. Not unkindly, just accurately. She moves to the next glass. She finishes refilling the table. She returns to the service station. She straightens the tray. She stands at the perimeter of the room and watches, as she has watched for 11 months, the machinery of the world turning. Its documents and its consequences, its words and their meanings, its silences and what they contain. Tomorrow morning, the governing law amendment will be drafted, reviewed, and signed before the merger closes. The indemnification cap will be correctly interpreted under English law. The €300 million exposure will be closed. The deal will proceed. 2 weeks later, a contract will arrive at the apartment in the Navigli district, where Sarah Mancini lives among her books and her translation dictionaries, and her grandmother's photograph on the desk. A formal engagement letter from the Ashworth Group proposing a retainer arrangement for specialist legal translation and contract review across 7 jurisdictions. At a rate that is, she will note with the particular satisfaction of someone who has long known the value of their own work, exactly what it should be. She will draft her response carefully. She will review the contract language herself before signing it. She will flag 2 points that require clarification. She will think of her grandmother. She will think of the phrase written in the margin of the Arabic manuscript on that desk, in Mondello, the one her grandmother wrote in her own hand during the last year of her life. Not a translation, not an academic note, but a simple declarative sentence in Italian, written in pencil as if she wanted to be able to take it back, and decided not to. Le parole appartengono a chi le capisce. Words belong to those who understand them. She will put the engagement letter in its envelope. She will walk to the desk. She will place her grandmother's photograph facing her, so that Professor Concetta Mancini, 7 books, 2 doctorates, a lifetime of margins filled with understanding, can look at what her granddaughter has done. She will sign the contract, and in the dining rooms of the world, in the private rooms where documents change, hands and words are weighed, and futures are determined by the precision of language and the arrogance of men who have never had to learn what they did not already know. The water will keep being poured. By women who read while they pour, who carry universities in their pockets, who find the wrong word in the right clause and say so, quietly, between the main course and the dessert, because the words belong to those who understand them. And understanding is not something that can be taken from a person by a wave of the hand, or a word said to the room. When you believe no one important is listening, someone is always listening. Someone always was. If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who has ever been dismissed before they were understood. The most expensive mistake is the one made in a room where you stopped paying attention. The night after the dinner, Sarah Mancini does not sleep easily. This is not unusual for her. She has always been a light sleeper. A person for whom the border between waking and rest is permeable, easily crossed and recrossed. The mind continuing its work in the hours the body has given up on. She lies in the dark of her Navigli apartment, which smells of the canal in autumn, and the particular quiet of a city that has briefly decided to rest, and she thinks about words, about the specific word, herunda, and the specific weight it was asked to carry, and the structural failure that occurs when a single word is expected to bear more meaning than its architecture can sustain. She thinks about her grandmother. Professor Concetta Mancini had a theory about legal language, which is to say, she had several theories. As professors of linguistics tend to accumulate theories the way other people accumulate furniture, until the house of the mind is somewhat crowded, and navigating it requires patience and a willingness to move sideways. But her central theory, the one she returned to most often in the last years of her life, was this: that the people who draft legal documents are generally not the people who understand language most deeply, and the people who understand language most deeply are generally not the people in the room when the documents are signed. And this gap between the depth of linguistic understanding required to make a contract truly airtight, and the depth of linguistic understanding typically applied in that effort, is the source of more litigation, more financial loss, more institutional ruin than any single other factor in commercial life. She had a name for this gap. She called it, in the private vocabulary she shared with Sarah during the long summer afternoons in Mondello, when they read aloud to each other in the garden, Italian, Arabic, French, English, taking turns, the grandmother correcting the granddaughter's pronunciation of Arabic fricatives, and the granddaughter correcting the grandmother's colloquial English. She called it l'intervallo di comprensione, the comprehension gap. Sarah had spent the past 11 months at the Hotel Cassini watching the comprehension gap operate in real time. She had watched men sign documents they had not read in languages they did not speak, and she had watched the consequences arrive, sometimes immediately and sometimes slowly, in the form of disputes and renegotiations, and the specific, expensive bewilderment of people who discover that words mean things they did not intend. She had found the gap in Article 9, Sub-Clause 4 in 2 seconds. 2 seconds of proximity, 2 seconds of attention, the brief alignment of a trained mind with an accessible page. 300 million euros, sitting on the width of that gap. She thinks about Dorian Ashworth. She has thought about men like him before, not with anger, which is too consuming an emotion for situations that require clarity, and not with contempt, which would require her to believe that he is less than he is. And she is honest enough to know he is not less than he is. He is simply a man who built his understanding of the world inside a room with walls, and spent so long inside that room that he stopped noticing the walls were there. The contempt he expressed for the service class was not the contempt of a cruel man. It was the contempt of a man who had never had a reason to look carefully at the person pouring his water. Those are different things. The first is a character flaw. The second is a structural failure, the comprehension gap applied to human beings rather than contracts. She thinks he knows this now. She thinks he will remember tonight for a long time. Not because she humiliated him, but because she didn't. She gave him the information. She let him reckon with it on his own terms. She watched him do it, and he did it with more grace than she had expected, and she is honest enough to give him that. She turns over. She looks at the ceiling. Outside, the canal makes its faint, old sound. She thinks about the card in her apron pocket, now on the nightstand, bone white in the dark. She thinks about the retainer arrangement he will propose. She is already certain it is coming, with the certainty of someone who reads people, the way she reads documents, tracking the structure beneath the surface. She thinks about what it would mean: stability, income, the ability to stop splitting her attention between the water pitcher and the laptop, the ability to do the work she trained for with the full weight of her concentration. She thinks about her grandmother's desk and the Arabic manuscripts, and the pencil note in the margin. Le parole appartengono a chi le capisce. Words belong to those who understand them. Yes, but belonging is not the same as possession. You do not own the words, you are their custodian. You are responsible for them, for finding them when they are missing, for correcting them when they are wrong, for hearing them when the room assumes they will not be heard. This is the work, not the prestige of the office, not the weight of the business card, not the distance between the service station and the head of the table. The work is the attention. The work is reading the page in the 2 seconds you are given. The work is saying what you found. She closes her eyes. Tomorrow she will go to the Cassini for the lunch shift. She will carry the pitcher. She will pour the water. She will listen to what the rooms contain. And when the right moment comes, as it always does, in the margins, in the space between the courses, in the brief interval, when the room believes it is unwatched, she will do what she has always done. She will pay attention. And the world, which has always underestimated what attention can do, will discover once again that the most important person in any room is not always the one at the head of the table. Sometimes it is the one beside it, holding the water, reading the document, knowing the word. Sometimes the word changes everything. If you have ever carried more than people could see in you, share this story. Someone needs to know that the comprehension gap closes when the right person decides to speak.